John Walton. He's working at Microsoft, and he, again, is going to talk about security and cloud computing.
Great. Thank you very much. Everybody hear me all right? So, as mentioned, my name is John Walton. I usually get one of two questions whenever somebody finds out my name is John Walton. It's usually either A, how closely are you related to the Walton family that started Walmart? Like Sam Walton, the answer is not close enough. Or two, I see some folks old enough in the audience may remember the show The Waltons, and yeah, I definitely do get called John Boy quite a bit. So let's talk a little bit about me, other than the fact that some people call me John Boy. I work at Microsoft today, and I manage a security team that's responsible for SoftwareplusServices. However, prior to joining Microsoft, I started my own company doing security consulting. Basically worked with a lot of financial verticals to cover just various security topics from network security all the way up to application level security. And then prior to that, worked for a company called Avaya. Over here, it's called Bosch Telecom. And I did a lot of voice over IP security for them as well. So pleasure to be talking to you guys here today. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the basis of this talk and where my experience and a lot of the stories I'm going to tell you later on in the presentation kind of derive from. So Microsoft is, like many companies, we actually are in cloud computing. As you saw Kurt talk about earlier, cloud computing is definitely the new wave. And Microsoft's offering here is really, from a business perspective, is the Microsoft Online Services, and I've got some of the products that we have up there. But there are many other companies like Google and IBM, Amazon was mentioned in Kurt's talk, that are also have a number of offerings. So, what I'm going to tell you about today is really what I've learned in the last 3 years and what my team's learned trying to build trustworthy services, and some of the things that you should keep in mind as you're looking at services, either from a security perspective or, as Kurt mentioned, maybe from a business perspective, utilizing them. But Microsoft Online Services is the first portfolio of software plus services, and I'll tell you the difference between software plus services and cloud computing a little later. But it's a subscription-based service for businesses. It's hosted in Microsoft data centers. It's very common for other companies like Google to have their own data centers around the world as well, and they'll host those services there. The development models for software plus services actually vary, which is kind of interesting, and we found a lot of differences in the security processes when you're developing a product that, say, ships every 2 years versus software plus services that may have releases happening on a very regular basis, sometimes even on a monthly basis. And just, things change when that occurs. So what does software plus services mean? We need to answer that question first, and as those have done research or have read a lot of the marketing speak, you'll see all kinds of different terms for that. I'm going to try to simplify that for us today when we get started. It's basically a best of breed things. You get a rich user experience, you get sometimes offline access, so it's not just your service only offerings, you actually can utilize your client bits that you're already familiar with. All your data is always available. You saw that in Kurt's talk, and of course, folks that run IT departments, security guys, that's one that kind of hits us and says, hey, do I really want all my data always available? So that's certainly one that sticks out to a lot of people. Form factors, you can access these things over the web using your browsers. You can also access them over mobile devices, which is very common. The last bullet, the latest version always being available, you'll hear that commonly touted as an advantage of software plus services or online services. And that's kind of true. I'll tell you about that a little bit today too. But the main thing is that the IT experience for manageability, compliance, all of that rests, in this one offering. That you heard Kurt talk about the economies of skill or the economies of scale. That's definitely true in these kind of offerings. But it leads to this agility. And so if we kind of step back and we look at what is cloud computing is really a general term. And it can mean many things to many different peoples. So on the bottom, you can see that IaaS, or infrastructure as a service, is really about having the ability to offer that networking capability. These are usually built on a power or storage or an infrastructure basis. The runtime environment is really there for putting virtual servers on there or putting actual operating systems on top of that. It's generally billed on a per hourly basis or gigabytes bandwidth or storage there as well. If you step up one layer, you actually have the platform as a service. And we'll give some examples of what actually falls in here. But platform as a service is really, again, one layer above the infrastructure, you're actually going to have, your access to the platform itself. Then you step up one more layer beyond that, you have software as a service. And that's usually billed on a per user per month basis. That's really where the end users are accessing. Now the difference between Software Plus Services and SaaS, excuse me, is really about taking advantage of the existing software you already have installed on your systems and then connecting that to your services. So again, it's not just an online offering. You don't just access things over the web. You may utilize your existing software and then connect with that. So that's the difference from a strategy perspective. If we actually take a look at some of the services stack here, in the infrastructure services, some examples there, we have Amazon EC², we have Rackspace, those are very popular infrastructure as a service offerings. The platform services, you have Amazon S3, you've got Salesforce, Windows Azure falls into that, and of course the Google App Engine falls there as well. For the platform services, it's really Force.com, but they're owned by Salesforce and as part of their offering. And of course, if we go up into the software as a service layer, the application stack, you have Google Apps, you have Salesforce.com, and then you've got Microsoft Online Services as well. But there really are a couple different slices of Software Plus Services or software as a service offerings. You can have consumer-based services. Those aren't new. We've actually seen those for many years. You've got things like Windows Live Messenger, ICQ, you name it. There's been tons and tons of consumer-based services available for many years now. The difference between those and a business service is that an IT generalist or an IT guy isn't involved in that. So if you remember Frank from the last presentation, he's not involved in purchasing or even utilizing those services necessarily. His end users just go and they try to use them. Now he has to manage that and maybe become part of his network or his infrastructure, but he's generally not involved in acquiring those technologies. They usually don't have a service level agreement, so no guarantees there. The revenue is generally ad-based, and of course from a Microsoft perspective, that's the Windows Live brand that you see for the consumer services. For the business class services, the differences there are pretty obvious. The IT generalist does procure those. He buys them for his organization. They usually do have service level agreements. Most common you'll find 3 and 9s for service level agreements. And they require a lot more enterprise grade security, right? And they require a lot more reliability because the business is making a bet on that kind of class of service. And of course, you have the subscription-based services on a per user or per month basis that we saw earlier. If you look at the business class services, you actually will find two different offerings. They'll either be dedicated services or shared services. Now, another way that you'll hear that term called is like a private cloud for the dedicated service or a public cloud for the shared service. The dedicated service is really, you're buying a set of systems or hardware that's dedicated just to you. So if you're acme.com, you're going to get a set of infrastructure and hardware that's specific for acme.com, and they're separated from, say, contoso.com. And the data is, of course, physically separated at that point. You have a lot more customization there. So if you want to say, this kind of operating system, I would like this kind of features enabled in my applications. Generally, that's something that you can select when you're buying those kind of services. But of course, there's a higher cost for that. In the shared service environment, you're actually a shared multi-tenant environment. So Acme and Contoso may actually be running on the same set of infrastructure, maybe the same set of platform, and possibly even the same service itself. The data, of course, at that point is logically separated instead of physically. And then you have limited customizations because the customizations would affect the rest of the tenants on that same set of systems. And of course, you get a lower cost for that. So at this point, let's talk about the security side of things. And I'm going to kind of tell you a little bit about our experiences at Microsoft and kind of tell you what we've learned over the years from doing that. But this is one of my favorite quotes from a vice president of ours, actually, in the Microsoft Online Services division, is that the hardest part, according to customers and according to our VP, is establishing trust. It goes back to that, Frank needs to trust his business partners thing. So this is really what our job is from a security perspective, regardless of whether we're building software or we're building software plus services. And of course, things like outages that every single company that offers services has ever had. you'll find articles about outages, and so that's certainly damaging one's reputation and the ability to establish that trust. But let me step back here a little bit more and talk about how when you build software plus services or when you build software as a service, how that differs from building traditional box product software, and it'll actually demonstrate some of the issues that folks will run into there. So in the traditional software market, generally people are familiar with the waterfall or spiral development models. They will be used to these long release cycles, multi-year release cycles. The patches are generally pulled from the clients. You have a lot of heavy activity from a security perspective. Maybe you actually perform stand downs and you do security reviews for multiple weeks, and you look for issues at that point. The software, of course, does run on the end user's system or on a server in the enterprise from a business perspective. But again, it's always on premise there. Whereas with S+S development, you actually have generally what's called the Agile development models. And I say Agile in quotes because there is an actual Agile process. Scrum may be a term you're familiar with. And some companies will utilize the actual Agile development process, or really it's just some kind of combination thereof, their traditional software development life cycles and some kind of Agile process. So when I use the term Agile, what I really mean by that is that it's a fast-paced release cycle, that these things need to be flexible, that you're going to constantly be pushing out new updates or bits out to the system a lot quicker than you're used to today. And that has some advantages and disadvantages. But your changes generally are incremental, so you may not have one really big release where you have tons and tons of features going in. You may actually have a release that has one feature, and the next release has another feature, and so forth. So that means that your security activities have to be very agile as well. So that's one of the things that we learned at Microsoft very quickly on when we were doing software plus services, is that we had to change the way that we did our security activities to make them flexible, to make them kind of follow with this agile process. And of course, with software plus services, you have software running on the end user system. You have maybe software running on the enterprise servers, but those are generally connected or have some kind of feature capability with a hosted service that's not on-premise for you. So some of the advantages of the software plus services method, or the agile development lifecycle, is that frequent updates are expected. So you actually start to learn that process, and because you're constantly making changes, you're able to sometimes push out changes quicker than you might have been if you were using your traditional development models. If you have emerging threats, those are generally easier to fix. And what I mean by that is, folks that are familiar with some of the old buffer overflow attacks, and Microsoft had to make architectural level changes in some of their systems, and provided data execution prevention, ASLR, all those kind of things. They had to put those into a major release, and that was a Service Pack release. You may recall Windows XP Service Pack 2 had a lot of those changes. But because that was major changes, to deal with those emerging threats, sometimes it took longer to push those updates out. Whereas in the Agile development model and with services, because you may have more control over the software that runs in the hosted environment, you may actually be able to mitigate issues quicker than you would in a traditional life cycle. In addition, you're able to actually respond to things in bits versus bytes, as I call it. What that means is that you may not have the full end-to-end solution for a particular problem that you're dealing with, whether that be security or not. You can make changes that incrementally help improve the system or protect the system from attacks, either as they're occurring or as new threats emerge as well. And so that's kind of a big benefit for us too. You can stage mitigation, so you can actually try the mitigation and see if it's working, and if it's not, you can learn from that and plan your next step a little bit better. One of the problems with traditional software development and changes is that you have this back compat problem. You generally are dealing with lots of older versions. You may have to support versions that are 5 years old, and you have very much more variability on the systems that you have to run on. Take like your standard patch from almost any company. They have to support many different hardware versions. They have to support a lot of different compatibility things between software and between versions. And so in the software plus services realm, especially on the services that, or the software that's running inside the hosted environment, you have less variability there. Generally, your hardware is pretty much standard across your entire deployment, and you don't have that many versions running there, usually maybe N-1 versions. And because of that, you don't have as much to test. right? And so that's also an advantage from a services perspective, is that you don't have, as much testing needs there, and you don't have to worry about the back compat. And of course, I mentioned earlier in the presentation that the latest version is always available. And I called that partially a myth, and I named that for a couple of different reasons. If you've ever had to run an IT environment, excuse me, you know that it takes time to actually push out patches. And sometimes you have to stage those patches and you have to roll them out over many weeks, maybe many months, depending on your business, because you don't want outages and you have to plan for those outages. The same thing's true in SoftwarePlusServices or any kind of SaaS offering. So it's important that you kind of keep that in mind. The business, of course, is going to try to protect themselves. The service providers are going to protect themselves as much as they can. And of course, the latest version always being available means that you don't have to support as many versions back. But of course, customers sometimes are resistant to upgrade to the next version. Maybe they have to train their organization for the new version, and so they may resist that upgrade for a while. And of course, that requires the service provider to maintain or support those versions going back as well. So let's talk a little bit about, from the security perspective, some of the things that you need to keep in mind as you're either developing services or maybe as you're utilizing services from different companies. Basically, I think of islands of opportunity as being the security experts, right? It's very important for organizations, if they can afford it, to hire security experts. And if whether you're going to be developing a service or whether you're actually going to be utilizing a service, here's some recommendations that I have for you. First of all, you need to have some kind of development process. Like Microsoft, we have the secure development lifecycle. Make sure that all of your engineers are utilizing that they're familiar with it, and that just becomes part of the standard process. And if you need to modify that system or engineering procedures to accommodate for these new Agile development models, then do that. At Microsoft, we had to create the Agile SDL in order to accommodate that. 2, the security engineers really should be performing a lot of research. Because cloud computing or services is a new technology, from a business perspective at least, it's very new. It's important to understand what those risks are going to be. And so within my team, a lot of the security research that we've been doing has been paying off as we consider adopting new technology and want to protect our customers as well. 3, manual security code reviews are very important. A lot of companies are getting a lot better about their development life cycles. They have things like the SDL. They may also have a great set of tools like we do at Microsoft for protecting the software that we build and finding issues as we find them. But those tools are still not necessarily mature enough especially when you enter into a new technology like cloud computing. So it's extremely important to offset that with manual code reviews and use those manual code reviews to actually understand how you may need to change your process, understand what additional tools that you may need. So that's been very useful for us. Of course, penetration testing is very important as well. Also paying off, same set of things, find new issues that maybe your existing tools don't today, or your process doesn't find. And of course, try to feed all of that back into the organization. So, my team's really responsible for supporting engineering. And it's very critical for us to take the lessons that we've learned and try to, feed that back in so that we don't continue to make any of the same mistakes that we made in the last milestone or release as well. Now, I'm not just saying that for job security, and I'm sure all folks in this room are like, all right, great, we have security folks here, and he's telling people that they should hire them. That's good. I really mean that, and we actually do have some positions open, so I figured since I had an opportunity to talk here, I'd at least mention that. Let me talk to the security professionals in the room directly for a moment here in this presentation. I see a lot of security folks really thinking that their job is to just raise the flag all the time, warn people about issues, and that's where their job ends. And unfortunately, I think that's a mistake. So I'm going to talk to those in the room that actually perform security engineering or security consultants, what have you. I really want to encourage folks, as a profession, we need to start maturing here. And what I would ask folks to do is really strive to kind of put yourself out of a job. And I mean that seriously, because there's never any lack of new technology for you to focus on in the future, so you really won't ever put yourself out of the job. It's important not only to find issues, but to identify fixes for those issues. And for the folks that you're working with, propose solutions, become part of that solution rather than part of the problem. And you'll find that people are generally a lot more willing to work with you, and you'll become more valuable from an organizational perspective. So you won't be seen just as a tax. And of course, learn to fight the right battles. As you find issues, make sure that you prioritize them for whoever that you're working with, whether that be an engineering organization, whether that be an IT organization. It really doesn't matter. Just make sure that you're fighting the right battles. It's just a lesson that we've learned. Now, a poll that I often give people, and I'm going to give this audience, is how many people think that security engineers should be able to stop a product from shipping? I kind of want to see some hands. Wow, full of marketing people in here. It's pretty good though. So thanks for raising your hands. I actually gave this talk to this portion of the talk to two different segments one time. One to the managers of an organization, and I saw almost no hands raised, and I gave it to a bunch of security engineers, and all of them raised their hands because they thought they should be able to stop our product from shipping, because that kind of excites some of us sometimes. So let me tell you a little bit about kind of a story where we actually had this happen in our organization. We were working on a product that was one of our first SoftwareplusServices offering. And throughout that entire development lifecycle, we actually had worked with the engineering organization. They were following the security practices to the letter. They were actually going above and beyond in many cases. So we were finding that they were an excellent partner to work with. They recognized the importance of security, and they were trying to do as much as they could, especially since they were a first offering there. Well, unfortunately, about a month before we were to ship this product, we identified a vulnerability which affected the service. And it was kind of a new type of vulnerability in the sense of, it wasn't just like a vulnerability in the client, it wasn't just a vulnerability in the online service. It turned out the change was late integration based, but as this change was pushed out to the online service, it would actually, push data down to the client, which was running on the end user system, and that would affect their browser security settings. And of course, then when they changed the browser security settings, you were affecting the security of every website that you were visiting. So it was a pretty big deal to us. Well, what we learned from that is that, one, good fortune never eludes people, but this kind always caught us, right? As we were just about to ship the product, we were you can imagine us riding this big wave. We were about to ship in a month, and we're just kind of buttoning down the hatches on the system, and last minute change, we find a vulnerability. The good news of the story is that we actually had a system in place to deal with this kind of issue late in the game. We had put together a process that said, okay, if we find a vulnerability just before we ship, we know exactly who to escalate to. We know the bar that we need to rate things against to identify whether it would be a ship stopper. We even took this process and said, okay, what if we ship and said, we find a vulnerability right after we ship or soon after we ship, how are we going to deal with that? And that process helped us immensely because we were able to put that process in place, just assuming the possibility of that happening. We were able to deal with the issue a lot more quickly than we would have if we hadn't had that process in place. And the great news behind that is we actually did stop shipping the product for a month. We delayed the shipping, for a month until we could go back, address the issue, and then do some investigation to make sure that we didn't have any of those kind of issues in the future. What was kind of neat about this is that we were able to quickly realize the security engineering return on your investment. Earlier in the presentation, I mentioned it's important to have security engineers, or experts working on the system if you can. And in this case, it was actually the security engineer that found it in a pre-production environment. He was doing his penetration testing in that environment because it was the main environment where things come together and actually are working as one. And so that's the area that you want to test with if you can. And of course, it illuminated a new kind of risk, where a change on the service may actually impact the actual client machines as well. That was important, and then we tested our process that we had actually put in place, which is also great. And of course, from that, we identified a number of changes that needed to happen. We needed tools to actually prevent this kind of issue in the future. We needed to be able to not depend solely on a manual process or a set of people to identify these issues. We want to actually prevent this automatically. And of course, that came with education as well to make sure that folks making those kind of changes understand the impacts that they're having. So as we move on into the next story that I have, we actually had a product that was acquired, and it was a software plus service offering as well. And the problem we ran into there is really, was really basically a cross-site scripting vulnerability. And for those that are in the room, you know there's two ways to protect those. One is you can protect that through input filtering, input validation. The other way is to actually encode the output to make sure that the data that's entered as input isn't treated as code on the other end. And so, you know, this organization, before they were acquired by our company, was actually, you know, familiar with cross-site scripting, and they decided to prevent those issues through output encoding. Well, what we found when we were actually doing manual code reviews and penetration testing is that we're able to find cross-site scripting vulnerabilities even though their threat models and, you know, their developers had thought of these things and tried to protect against them. But, you know, every security engineer that followed up on the product would find another vulnerability. And that sort of led us to go, okay, what's wrong with this situation? Why is it that, you know, every time we take a look at this particular product, we find new sets of vulnerabilities or, you know, same vulnerabilities? And what we learned is that, you know, first of all, we needed to improve our testing techniques. And what I mean by that is, if you're familiar with, you know, these web applications and cross-site scripting, you know, most people test these by just simply hitting every page and every parameter on the web, you know, application. But in SoftwareplusServices, the systems are a lot more complex. And so it may be that before a page or a parameter is available, you actually need to use some kind of feature in the web application, or maybe you need to use a feature in coordination with a feature on the client end. And because of that, certain pages or parameters wouldn't actually light up until you did that. And so we actually had to improve our testing techniques. Secondly, we found that, again, the manual code reviews were extremely valuable. As we identified, hey, this is an issue, let's go back to the code that we have access to and try to identify these issues before they go out the door. And we learned a very valuable lesson here, which is defense in depth. You know, most security professionals realize that that's important, but your engineers may not. And so it's extremely important to remember that, you know, if you have a vulnerability that has multiple mitigations, it's often best to use those multiple mitigations because, you know, if you have one that falls down or one that's not implemented, you're hoping that the other mitigation will protect against those kind of issues. So in this case, what we did is we took a look at the product and we said, hey, let's start fixing the missing output encoding cases. And since it's a service and we're agile and we're constantly making changes to the system, let's roll those changes out as we find them. And so basically fix the issues as we find them. Meanwhile, let's work on the longer term solution, which is to re-architect the protection or the security mitigations here, and let's implement an additional defense mechanism on top of output encoding and do input filtering and validation and try to protect against that as well. So that was something we did there too. So as security engineers, we often hear, you know, excuses for why vulnerabilities aren't fixed. And this is, of course, you know, one of my favorite excuses. Every company I've ever worked at, I hear somebody give me this excuse that, hey, that particular security bug has been there for years, we're probably safe, it's not a problem. And I really, I'm sure most of you probably drives you nuts as well. So, you know, what I recommend to folks is respond with a very light-toned, you know, tradition response, which is just because you've always done it that way, it doesn't mean it's not incredibly stupid. And what I mean by that is, you know, think about how things could be exploited and, you know, deal with those misconceptions that folks may have about, you know, a bug being there for a long time and why it's important. In one case, we actually had a development organization that kind of gave us the following answers. Nobody's ever exploited that. And since we actually run the services, they're hosted in our data centers and we operate them, if they had exploited it, we'd know about it. This is a common misconception, unfortunately, with a lot of folks that are new to services. And I want to dispel that misconception as much as I can. So what we ended up doing with this particular organization is we wanted to ask the question, okay, if nobody's like ever exploited this, how do we really know that? And if they have exploited it, how can we be certain that they actually, that we would catch it or that our operations counterparts would actually catch this? So we took these particular set of vulnerabilities. They were blended threats. They weren't, you know, just one-off vulnerabilities. You actually had to combine multiple vulnerabilities in order to really gain access, any, you know, significant level of access to the system. And we actually tried it out on the organization. We decided that, hey, let's try to exploit our own organizations and see what happens. You know, it was a good way to develop proof of concepts, and when you actually need to do that, feel free to utilize that resources. Make sure you have sufficient buy-off on that. But it's great actually to exercise not only those exploit skills that our hackers and the people we're defending against have. But it's also important to test, those assumptions that nobody's ever exploited that, or an assumption that, hey, if they had, we'd know about it, to see if the operations folks did. In this particular case, we were able to get away with it for quite a while, and we used that in our training to that organization. We actually, popped up screenshots of their systems and their data, internally showing, hey, we had access to the system, we've been accessing it for months, and maybe nobody noticed that. Of course, that followed with how do we protect that so that in the future we do know about it. So that kind of leads to one of my favorite screenshots is, exploiting your coworkers can be fun, and it can be the right thing to do, given sufficient buy-off on that. So. With that, let me tell you a little about some of the risks that SoftwarePlusServices are actually going to have. These are common risks that I've seen and that my team has actually experienced as we try to develop trustworthy services. Multi-tenancy is a really big thing. Multi-tenancy meaning you actually have more than one tenant running on the same system, possibly at the same time, is going to actually develop new security threats. A lot of the companies that are actually doing services are taking their existing products that weren't designed for this multi-tenant environment, and they're utilizing that to have a multi-tenant offering, and because of that, there are going to be new types of vulnerabilities. There are going to be new threats as well. Remember earlier I mentioned this vulnerability or threat that we had, changes to the service ended up impacting the client itself. That's a new type of threat. You're going to see a lot of performance and scalability demands that you hadn't seen if you were developing just traditional box products or products that run in the enterprise. Performance was important then, but when you actually have multiple tenants and you have, these service level agreements where if you go down, you actually have to pay your customers, performance, scalability, reliability become far more important than they had in the past. You also deal with software-only assumptions where, they were assuming that the client bits or the end user were connecting within the enterprise to the software. And now when you actually take that and you connect over the internet to access data or access, the application, you're going to have, the previous assumptions that weren't correct. And of course, a lot of online services or SoftwarePlusServices offering allow users to upload content. And what we're seeing a lot of times in our research as well as in our reviews is this hosting of untrusted content can become a real problem, especially when you have multiple tenants on the same system. So it's very important to deal with that. So in the next story I'm going to tell you actually kind of demonstrates some of these issues. So we had a product that wasn't designed for the online service, and that particular product, when it was getting enabled for an online service or a SoftwarePlusServicing offering, we realized that, hey, it may have dealt with multi-tenancy from a user perspective. It's used to having, multiple users from the same company connecting, but it's not necessarily the case where you have different users from different companies connecting to the same system, or a case where you actually have different administrators all affecting the same system. So a lot of these SoftwarePlusServicing offers have the notion of an administrator, take Exchange Online or SharePoint Online. And previously, when those products were designed, they were designed for a single administrator or a set of administrators that all belong to the same organization. And of course, in a multi-tenant environment or a shared offering, that's not the case, right? You actually have, an administrator of Contoso.com, an administrator for Acme.com, and you have new types of issues there. So what we ended up doing was we did some research to identify whether there were a previous set of bugs that had been punted or won't fixed, if you will, because they assumed, hey, it's an administrator from the same company that would be able to do this. So we went actually back through the old features and through the old bug database and their threat models. And anytime we saw an assumption or a bug getting punted or won't fix because somebody said, well, an administrator of Acme.com could do this to another administrator of Acme.com, but that's like hanging another member of your own organization, or maybe that's like shooting yourself in the foot. So that's maybe not critical enough security vulnerability to fix. And what we found is that there was actually a set of bugs there that in this new scenario, in this new world that we live in, they actually become issues because it's now not administrator of Acme shooting himself in the foot, he's shooting the administrator of Contoso in the foot, and that becomes a problem. So we actually try to deal with those kind of things at design time and make sure that the new products that we're building and the new features that we're building actually have this service-oriented architecture, that they understand that there are new threats associated with that, and we have to account for those. And that really brings us to my next point, which is change. Winds of change they blow hard enough. Those trivial things where an administrator could do something to themselves now become deadly projectiles when they actually can affect other users on the same system. But change is good, right? Cloud computing, software plus services, there are actually a lot of advantages, as I talked about earlier. Keep in mind, though, that you need to do valuable bug scrubs. You actually need to make sure that you understand your new scenarios and how those previous assumptions may affect you. Again, multi-tenancy is extremely important. Try to deal with this service-oriented architecture. If you're building new products or products that even you don't think may be enabled for cloud computing, keep in mind that someday someone may take that and actually put it online, and there will be new threats associated with that. So some of the other challenges that I'm not going to cover today, but I wanted to at least leave you with, is that change control is a necessary evil. Because you're going to be making changes more often, more commonly, these quick release cycles, you actually have to have a change control process in place. So you need to make sure that the sufficient design reviews or code reviews or approval levels are actually in place before you put the bits out into the hosted environment, because you don't want to affect customers' SLAs or any of your security at that point. Late integrations are something to watch out for. As things kind of come together, it's usually late in the game because these development life cycles are quick. So again, earlier I mentioned if you're going to do penetration testing and you're part of an organization building a service, try to do that testing or that penetration testing either in pre-production or, if you have to, in production environments, so you make sure you actually test the real-world scenarios. Release tracking is very important. So a lot of times for services, you're actually going to have multiple releases going on at the same time. And so what we found is actually having a tracking process in place and having somebody dedicated towards that to make sure all the checks and are written and all the T's are crossed and I's are dotted. That becomes very important. Because these releases are very fast, it becomes even more important. So try to take these manual processes that you have and automate them as much as possible. It'll pay off 10 times fold every time. Some of the other challenges that I actually hear when I talk to customers, and I'm sure at the end of this presentation I'd love to hear questions and stuff about this. But some of the most common things that I hear from customers about, hey, I want to, I understand what cloud computing is, but I'm a little bit concerned about moving to it. How do I know that I can trust you? How do I know that I can still maintain control of the data? Somebody earlier asked a question in Kurt's presentation. If the company goes under, or if I need to get access to my data, I don't control it at that point. It's actually hosted somewhere else. How do I get that? That's a very common question. We often get questions about where's my data located. That's important for customers to ask as well. And most of these companies, have data centers around the world. So you may have some choice as to where your data is located. And over time, we're going to continue to see these data centers, pop up in many different locations around the world. So you'll have even more flexibility there as well. Of course, you'll have backups too between systems, so keep that in mind. Generally, with a lot of the service providers, they'll have a primary data center and a backup data center. They are generally trying to keep them geographically located, not only from a bandwidth perspective, but just from a legal perspective as well, to keep that data say in the same country or in the same region of countries as well. But these are challenges that you should think about and ask as you look into cloud computing and software plus services. A lot of companies as well, because it's hard to establish this trust. I mentioned that as our VP's most commonly asked question. I get that question a lot. I think it's important for companies to go out and do what we're doing, is try to talk about, here's some of the issues that we've run into, here's how we've dealt with them. I think that goes towards this trust relationship. The second thing is a lot of companies are also having external companies come in and validate their processes or validate their offerings. So you have a lot of security consulting companies maybe rubber stamping the offering. We had heard a question earlier that how do we make sure that you have right up to the patch level and whatnot. Some providers will offer the right to audit. That's something you should ask them. Do they provide the right to audit? And is that something you can do? And if they don't, do they have any external third-party validation for their systems? And that's another way that you can be more confident that your data is protected as well. With that, I'm just going to leave you with one of my favorite slides for what is Software Plus Services. And I encourage folks to either look into it or consider that for certain parts of your business or certain data, it may be the right solution for you. And just consider your options and go with the best ones there. That, one last final note that we do have some job openings, and I'd love to talk to people about that. I'm constantly looking, and I'll take some questions at this point. So.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Would you raise your hand if you have a question? Wow. You covered pretty
silence,
much
I
all
guess. I don't know.
the details, yeah. Seriously, no one with a question? Then I'm going to ask you just a very odd other question,
Sure.
Which is, I'm sure you've heard about a paper that came out like a couple of months ago by students from the MIT and the University of California about physical security in the cloud and how all these threats that we've seen and that we take into account if we make a decision on whether to move to a cloud computing environment or not. There is the possibility of mapping out, of making the cartography of where specific services of a company or the company service itself are hosted, like the location, and then trying to set up another server, another service of the malicious attacker basically on the same server as to get the advantage for side channel attacks, for instance, denial of service attacks, whatever. Could you probably elaborate a little bit about these concerns?
Yeah, so that paper actually that you're describing was pretty fascinating. Basically, these two researchers had found out that some of these companies, usually they're infrastructure providers or platform providers, assume or claim maybe that your data can move around. It could be anywhere in data centers around the world, and you really don't have any idea where that may be the case. They actually demonstrated through this research paper that they could identify where the data was stored, and then of course target those specific locations as well. And I think that's a really good lesson for a lot of service providers, and not only that, IT generalists who are procuring these services to keep in mind that anytime somebody claims that your data could be located in any world and that's a security advantage, that's really just security by obscurity. So assume that a user will actually be able to access your data and figure out where that data may be, and you should rely on other security mechanisms to make sure that the service provider actually assumes that that's the case, and they have other security mechanisms in place to prevent that. So I think that's a good lesson learned. From a denial of service perspective, I think that's really kind of an interesting question. A lot of people ask me this question about what about denial of service, and I think what's interesting there is that with these business class services, you have a service level agreement. So if you end up getting affected by a denial of service, because the service provider goes out, or maybe they're targeted, or your specific instance of the service is targeted, and you have some kind of outage, they're going to end up paying you back for that, right? And in today's world, denial of service is a threat to any organization. So what's kind of interesting is I kind of flip that around on people and say, hey, what if you had a denial of service today where you're running that in your enterprise, whether that be a malicious attack or maybe you just have some kind of hardware outage or what have you. You end up having to spend additional resources to address that. Whereas in the Software Plus Services or Software as a Service offering, you're not the one spending resources for that. It's the service provider. And on top of that, if you have an outage, you're going to get some kind of reimbursement for that if they have a service level agreement. It's within that agreement as well. So it turns out those kind of things can be an advantage of why you might want to move to a Software Plus Services offering. The other thing that I often tell people is, where do you store your money? We talk about like data privacy and trust, and it's the service provider has that. Money's the same way, right? How many of us actually store our money at home under our mattress or in the closet? You know, not very many, right? And the reason for that is that we can be certain that we're protecting our assets or our money that way. So we go to somebody who's better at that, these economies of skill, and we use banks, you know. And that might be not a great example given this economy sometimes, but traditionally banks are more secure. They can actually protect your assets a little better than you might be able to at home. And so software plus services can be very attractive to especially the smaller businesses where they don't have security expertise and they don't have the luxury of spending money on hiring those security expertise, so they have to rely on service providers to actually do that for them. And because those service providers are providing lots and lots of customers with that, they may actually have the resources to hire skilled folks to do that as well. So that's also another reason to possibly go that route as well. But again, as Kurt mentioned earlier, the answer is yes and no. You really have to look at a case-by-case basis. You have to, you know, do a risk management, understand what data you're willing to part with, and kind of, you know, allow a service provider to establish that trust with and make sure that they protect that. Ask the right questions. You know, as a security expert, I love to hear those kind of questions, and it drives change within organizations. And so it's great. Ask those questions, but keep in mind for certain, you know, segments and certain scenarios, your best bet might be the service offerings. That was a long answer to your question, I think.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? No, everyone is tired. Okay, thank you so much, John Walton.
Thanks,
and
guys.
we're going into a short coffee break until 4 p.m. See you then.